Imagine a patient's heart stops beating. They stop breathing. A doctor steps into the room, checks the monitors, and declares clinical death.
Right, the official time of death.
Exactly. Biologically speaking, the clock has completely stopped. But then days pass, sometimes even weeks, and the person's body, it just refuses to decompose.
Which is, it's wild to even think about.
It really is. In fact, their skin remains supple, their face keeps its color, and they exhibit this undeniable, almost lifelike glow.
Yeah, it creates a really profound rupture in our understanding of biology. When you actually observe this phenomenon, it fundamentally challenges the rigid timeline we associate with, the end of a human life. It forces us to ask if death is just this instant event, like a switch flipping, or a much longer, far more complex transition.
Welcome to the deep dive. We know you're listening today because you're captivated by those rare intersections where ancient human traditions and, well, modern clinical observation collide.
Revealing a world that's far stranger than our standard models suggest.
Exactly. So today, we are exploring a phenomenon known as Tukdam. It's this highly guarded, deeply esoteric meditative state observed primarily in the Vajrayana tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And the reason it commands our attention is that it's a state of active meditation that supposedly occurs after clinical death.
Yeah, and if you look at the compiled documentation on this, ranging from centuries-old foundational texts to literally recent neurological observations, the claims are just staggering. We are going to examine the very precise physical anomalies of this state, delve deeply into the Tibetan subtle body mechanics that supposedly make it possible, and look closely at what happens when this protected sacred practice meets empirical testing by modern scientists.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by anchoring this highly spiritual concept in observable physical reality. Because when we talk about Tukdam, we aren't just talking about a poetic metaphor for peaceful passing, right?
No, not at all.
We are talking about flesh and bone literally defying entropy.
Yeah, and to appreciate how anomalous this is, we have to establish the typical cascade of biological decay. Usually, within hours of clinical death, algor mortis sets in as the body cools to room temperature.
Just standard biology.
Exactly. Then livor mortis follows as blood pools, and then rigor mortis stiffens the muscles. Shortly after that, cellular breakdown begins, and bacteria rapidly initiate putrefaction. But a body in Tukdam, which, by the way, is a Tibetan term translating roughly to holy mind or sacred mind, it halts this process entirely.
It just stops it.
Yeah, the minimal signs of decomposition can be maintained for anywhere from a few days to several weeks.
And it isn't just a generic preservation like mummification or something. Sogyal Rinpoche, in his widely studied Tibetan book of Living and Dying, provides a very specific checklist of physical markers. For instance, the face doesn't grow pallid, it retains a distinct color and this luminous glow.
Right, and the cartilage of the nose, which typically begins to sink inward shortly after death as tissues dehydrate, that remains perfectly intact.
Wow.
The skin actively resists decaying and actually remains soft and pliable to the touch.
The absence of rigor mortis is particularly striking to me. I mean, the muscles do not lock up. Furthermore, eyewitness accounts from medical professionals and monks alike note that the eyes do not cloud over in the typical manner. They are described as keeping a soft and compassionate glow.
Yeah, but the most confounding physical marker, the one that truly baffles external observers, is the temperature. Despite a complete cessation of blood circulation, there is a palpable warmth concentrated specifically at the center of the chest, right at the heart.
A physical warmth radiating from the heart potentially weeks after the blood has stopped pumping. I mean, that flies in the face of thermodynamic laws. Think of a heavy locomotive engine that has been completely switched off.
Right, the pistons aren't firing.
Exactly. The fuel line is cut, the train is absolutely stationary. But deep inside that massive iron block, the latent heat is so intensely concentrated that it prevents the surrounding oil and water from freezing over for days, even in the dead of winter.
I love that. That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. The active kinetic functions, the pumping heart, the breathing lungs, they ceased. But a residual, highly focused state is actively stalling the thermodynamic decline.
It's just wild.
It is. The physical body is stationary, but an intense internal preservation is occurring. And because of this, the surrounding community treats the situation with an incredibly strict protocol.
Right. They treat the room like a sacred laboratory. Absolute silence is enforced. The environment is kept completely undisturbed.
They take great care to ensure the master's body is never touched or moved. out of fear that a sudden physical jolt could disrupt whatever delicate internal process is holding entropy at bay.
And it's fascinating that the community knows Tukdam has finally ended only when that latent heat dissipates and the body finally begins to show the normal, expected signs of decomposition.
Yeah, that's the clear exit sign.
But I have to ask the critical question here. If there is zero blood flow, zero oxygen being delivered to the cells, how are the body's natural bacteria not just devouring the tissue? From a purely materialistic standpoint, the cells should be breaking down. What exactly is the Tibetan Buddhist tradition saying is actively keeping this biological material intact?
What's fascinating here is that the Tibetan explanation completely bypasses cellular biology.
Oh, really?
Yeah. To understand how they view this, we have to look at their model of the subtle body, which involves mechanics entirely foreign to Western anatomy. In Vajrayana Buddhism, the physical body is intertwined with a network of subtle energy channels called nadis, and the energy that flows through them is called prana, or vital wind.
So they view the biological organs as almost secondary to this underlying energy grid.
Precisely. They believe that at the moment of death, a very specific sequence dissolution of these vital winds occurs. The energies associated with the physical elements, earth, water, fire, and air, they systematically collapse inward.
Retreating from the extremities.
Exactly, which explains why the limbs grow cold, and they gather in the central channel, eventually concentrating at the heart center.
Which perfectly explains the localized warmth Sogyal Rinpoche describes. The engine heat has been pulled from the outer compartments and focused entirely in the core.
Right. And that concentration of subtle energy at the heart is the preamble to what the tradition calls the clear light stage, or ground luminosity. This is the absolute crux of Tukdam. When all gross physiological functions and all chaotic thought patterns dissolve, what remains is the absolute most fundamental nature of mind.
Pure, unclouded awareness.
Exactly. The tradition asserts that the consciousness does not extinguish when the brain shuts down. Rather, it drops into this pristine, foundational state.
This brings up a detail in the sources that I found incredibly compelling. You might assume this ground luminosity is an elite VIP room reserved exclusively for high lamas.
Right, like only the masters get to go there.
Yeah, but the texts explicitly state that passing through the clear light is a universal phenomenon. It is available to every single human being at the moment of death.
It's the unavoidable bottleneck of the death process. Every human consciousness passes through it. However, the average person is completely overwhelmed by the physiological trauma of dying.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, without decades of intense meditative training, a person's consciousness essentially blacks out or panics as the gross physical senses collapse. They pass through the clear light but never recognize it, moving swiftly into the subsequent stages of death and rebirth.
So what does this all mean for the average person? If the tradition says this state is available to everyone, does that imply we all pass through this clear light, but we're just too distracted or unpracticed to notice it?
That perfectly encapsulates it. They aren't just enduring it, the masters. I mean, they're utilizing it. An expert practitioner has spent their entire life engaged in advanced meditation practices, specifically simulating the death process. They have familiarized themselves with the subtlest levels of their own consciousness. So when clinical death arrives, they simply rest their awareness in that clear light. The texts emphasize that the duration of Tukdam is directly proportional to the depth of the practitioner's lifelong realization.
They hold that focus so completely that Sogyal Rinpoche notes many masters enter death sitting perfectly upright in a traditional meditation posture. Or they transition in the posture of the sleeping lion, lying on their right side. It frames death not as a catastrophic biological failure to be fought in an ICU, but as an intentional, navigated transition.
It is a radical reframing of mortality. In this framework, consciousness operates independently of the gross physical brain, and by stabilizing that subtle consciousness in the heart center, the practitioner inadvertently exerts a stabilizing force on the physical tissue, delaying decay.
And this framework isn't just an oral myth passed down in whispers. The sources show a vast, highly systematized body of literature. We're talking about foundational academic and spiritual texts like Death and Rebirth in Tibetan Buddhism by Lhotse Rinpoche and Jeffrey Hopkins, or Mind Beyond Death by Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpo.
Yeah, these aren't just collections of spooky stories.
Exactly. They are intricate manuals mapping the topography of a dying mind.
They map it with the precision of a psychological science. And if you look at Dieter Berlacher's compilation, Testimonies of Tibetan Tulkus, you find rigorous, documented accounts from reincarnate masters in exile detailing these exact transitions. The internal logic of the tradition is airtight. But of course, Ancient traditions today do not exist in a vacuum.
No, they don't.
Eventually, this profound spiritual framework had to meet the harsh light of modern medical diagnostics.
Which brings us to the inevitable collision. What happens when you take an ancient esoteric practice that relies on absolute silence and reverence and you roll a bunch of medical machinery into the room?
Yeah, this is perhaps the most unique aspect of the Tukdam phenomenon. The push to hook these meditating bodies up to clinical machines didn't come from a skeptical Western scientist looking to debunk a myth. The initiative came directly from the 14th Dalai Lama.
The head of the tradition itself invited the scientists in. That is incredibly bold. The sources note that this call for empirical study actually brought the concept of Tukdam out of esoteric isolation and made it a major topic of discussion among Tibetan exiles. But why did the Dalai Lama do it? Was he trying to prove to the West that Tibetan magic is real?
Well, it's much deeper than that. The Dalai Lama has long advocated that both Buddhism and science are rigorous methodologies for discovering truth. If they are both investigating reality, they shouldn't contradict each other. He invited neuroscientists to study Tukdam, not just to validate the tradition, but to fundamentally challenge Western science's rigid, biologically deterministic definitions of the boundary between life and death.
He wanted a dialogue.
Exactly. He wanted to force a conversation about where consciousness actually resides.
And that invitation led to a landmark moment. In 2021, a formal scientific study was conducted by a team of researchers who were granted unprecedented access to critically observe practitioners who had just entered clinical death. And their primary tool of measurement was the electroencephalogram, or EEG, to scan for any neurological activity.
The logistical difficulty of this study cannot be overstated. You have a highly sacred, silent environment where the body is not to be disturbed, and scientists have to respectfully attach electrodes to the scalp of a master who is clinically dead but showing no signs of decay.
Talk about high pressure.
Seriously. They were looking for any subtle, measurable brain waves. They wanted to see if that latent heat in your engine analogy was translating into measurable electricity in the brain's cortex.
They were looking for a biological footprint of the clear light, and the results, they found nothing. Zero. The 2021 study detected absolutely no brain activity in these individuals. By the standards of an EEG, the brains were completely electrically silent.
Completely flatlined.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you have this profound paradox staring you in the face. If a 2021 EEG study shows zero brainwaves, a pure scientific materialist would look at that readout and say, case closed, the cortex is offline, the machine says they are dead, therefore there is no conscious experience happening.
Yeah, from a purely neurological standpoint, the cessation of electrical activity in the cortex is the definitive marker of death. Without brainwaves, Western medicine asserts that complex awareness is physically impossible.
But, and this is a massive but, that flat line on the monitor does not explain the physical reality in the room. A silent EEG does not explain why the skin remains elastic. It doesn't explain why the nose cartilage hasn't collapsed, or why there is still warmth radiating from the center of the chest days after the blood has stopped moving.
Right, the bacteria should be multiplying.
The entropy should be taking over, so we're left with this incredible tension. Does the lack of measurable brain waves invalidate the spiritual phenomenon, or does it mean our machines are simply incapable of measuring the kind of energy that keeps a body from rotting?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the findings of the 2021 study actually do not contradict the Tibetan Buddhist claims at all. In fact, if you read the tradition closely, a flat EEG is exactly what you would expect to find.
Wait, really? How does a flat line prove their point?
Because the Tibetan tradition explicitly states that Tukdam occurs after the cessation of the gross physical body. They aren't claiming the practitioner is in a deep, undetected biological coma. They fully acknowledge that the heart has stopped, the breath has ceased, and the physical brain is dead.
Oh.
Yeah, the EEG simply confirms clinical death by Western medical standards, which is the prerequisite for Tukdam to even begin.
That completely shifts the perspective. They aren't saying, look, our monks can keep their brains alive without oxygen. They're saying, our monks are dead, their brains are dead, but their consciousness has retreated to a level that your machines cannot measure. And that subtle consciousness is what's preserving the tissue.
Precisely. Western science is looking for consciousness in the electrical firing of the physical brain. But the Tibetan model suggests that the fundamental ground luminosity operates entirely independent of those electrical pathways. The tension remains because science currently has no framework for a consciousness that can exist without a biological substrate, let alone a consciousness that can exert a physical preservative force on dead tissue.
The medical equipment is scanning for an FM radio broadcast, but the tradition is telling them the signal has shifted to an AM frequency that their antenna just can't pick up. And until we build a machine that can measure that subtle energy at the heart center, we are basically at a stalemate.
It is a profound frontier. The Wikipedia article and the surrounding literature present these two realities side by side. The empirical measurement of total brain death alongside the undeniable physical observation of delayed decomposition. It doesn't declare a victor between science and spirituality. It simply highlights the vast gap in our understanding of what happens when a human life ends.
It is honestly incredible to pull back and look at the journey we've just been on. We started by looking at a stark physical anomaly. Human bodies that refuse to obey the normal, gruesome laws of biological decay, retaining a lifelike flexibility, color, and a warm heart for days or weeks after clinical death is declared.
Yeah, and then we explored the profound philosophical architecture behind that anomaly. The Tibetan subtle body system, the practitioner's ultimate goal of resting in the ground luminosity, and the lifelong mental discipline required to maintain pure awareness while the physical body collapses.
And finally, we examine that fascinating collision with modern science, where EEG technology definitively confirms the absolute silence of the brain, even as the body continues to defy entropy, perfectly illustrating the Dalai Lama's desire to push the boundaries of what we define as life.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Consider how your own culture or your own personal worldview frames the exact moment of death. We are heavily conditioned by the medical model to view it as a sudden switch flipping off. The heart stops, the monitor flatlines, and the story immediately ends. But this deep dive asks us to consider the possibility of a gradual fade, a profound transition that our current biological models barely understand.
It challenges everything we take for granted about the boundaries of human existence. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Think back to that image of the meditation master, sitting perfectly upright in the posture of the sleeping lion, glowing and remarkably warm, yet completely silent on every medical monitor we possess. If an expert practitioner can supposedly maintain a stabilized form of consciousness and actively delay the decay of their own biological cells without generating a single measurable brainwave, what does that suggest about the true location of human consciousness? Is who we are entirely confined to the electrical firing of neurons inside our skulls? Or is there a foundational layer of the human experience, a deeper luminosity, that our current scientific instruments simply haven't learned how to measure yet?